The dust hadn't even settled on the Great Depression when two broke, hungry kids from the wrong side of Dallas decided they'd rather die shooting their way through America than starve quietly within its borders. They didn't have castles. They didn't have crowns. They had a stolen Ford, a sawed-off shotgun, and each other, and somehow, that was enough to make them immortal. Decades later, when game designers sat down to build the criminal heart of Vice City for GTA 6, they didn't reach for mafia dons or drug lords first. They reached for a girl with lipstick-red nails gripping a gun in the passenger seat, and a boy who smiled at death like it was an old friend. This is the story of Bonnie and Clyde, not the myth, not the movie, but the real two kids who turned poverty into legend, love into a loaded weapon, and a Louisiana back road into the final scene of American outlaw history. Before you sink into this one, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right there as this story pulls you in? Whether it's midnight in Manila or a quiet afternoon in Ohio, I want to know who's riding along with me into the shadows tonight. Now settle in, because this isn't just a crime story. This is a love story that ends in a hailstorm of bullets, and it starts, like so many American tragedies do, with nothing at all. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in March of 1909 in Ellis County, Texas, into a family so poor that poor barely covers it. His parents were tenant farmers, which is a polite way of saying they worked land that would never belong to them, scraping cotton out of dry Texas soil for landlords who lived comfortably somewhere else. When the crops failed, and in Texas in the early 1900s, they failed often, the Barrows didn't have a cushion to fall back on. They had nothing. Eventually, like thousands of other displaced farming families, the Barrows packed up what little they owned and moved to Dallas, settling into a squalid, makeshift camp under a viaduct in a neighborhood called West Dallas. It wasn't really a neighborhood. It was a slum built on hopelessness, where families lived in tents and shacks cobbled together from scrap wood and tin, where the air smelled like the nearby cement plant, and where a kid growing up had exactly two examples of what adulthood looked like: back-breaking labor for pennies, or crime. Clyde had 6 siblings, and from an early age, he was quiet, almost gentle in demeanor, but sharp-eyed in a way that told you he was always calculating an angle. He wasn't book smart in any traditional sense, school was a luxury his family couldn't really afford to prioritize, but he was clever in the way that survival makes a person clever. He noticed things. He noticed which store owners left their register unattended. He noticed which cars had keys left in the ignition. He noticed, most importantly, that the rules that governed men in suits downtown simply didn't apply to men in his position, because the system had never been built with people like him in mind. By his teenage years, Clyde was already drifting into petty theft, stealing turkeys, shoplifting, boosting cars for joyrides that sometimes turned into something more permanent. It wasn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was resourcefulness born out of a childhood that offered no other currency. His older brother Buck was already deep into a life of small-time crime by the time Clyde was a teenager, and Buck became something of a dark mentor, showing Clyde the ropes of burglary, car theft, and the general art of not getting caught, though, notably, Buck himself got caught plenty. Clyde bounced in and out of minor scrapes with the law throughout his late teens, developing a reputation among Dallas police as a nuisance rather than a genuine threat. He wasn't violent. Not yet. He was just a young man who'd learned, correctly, that the Dallas economy had no room for him unless he made room for himself. And then, in January of 1930, everything changed, not because of a robbery, not because of a shootout, but because of a plate of hot chocolate. Clyde had gone to visit a friend, a young woman recovering from a broken arm, at a house in West Dallas. In the kitchen, making hot chocolate for the household, was a tiny, fiery, strikingly pretty 19-year-old named Bonnie Elizabeth Parker. She was barely 5 feet tall, with strawberry blonde hair and an intensity in her eyes that made people remember her long after she left a room. Bonnie had been born in October 1910 in Rowena, Texas, and like Clyde, her early life had been shaped by economic devastation. Her father, a bricklayer, died when she was just 4 years old, and her mother, widowed, with 3 children and no income, moved the family to Cement City, an industrial suburb of Dallas that was, in its own way, just as bleak as West Dallas. Bonnie's mother worked as a seamstress, taking in sewing to keep her children fed, and Bonnie grew up watching her mother's hands blister and bleed for wages that never stretched far enough. But Bonnie was different from the other girls in Cement City. She was whip-smart, genuinely gifted academically, winning a school award in creative writing and, in another life, a life where she'd been born into money instead of misery, she might have become a poet, a journalist, an actress. She loved performing. She loved being watched. Teachers remembered her as vivacious and dramatic, the kind of girl who commanded a classroom without even trying. But smart didn't pay the bills in Cement City in the 1920s, and by 16, Bonnie had dropped out of school and married a small-time criminal named Roy Thornton. It was a disaster almost immediately. Roy drifted in and out of jail, in and out of her life, and eventually simply vanished from it, though notably, Bonnie never divorced him, and would be wearing his wedding ring on the day she died 5 years later, a strange, sad detail that tells you something about how complicated her heart really was underneath the legend. By the time she met Clyde Barrow in that West Dallas kitchen, Bonnie was working as a waitress, barely scraping by, technically still married to a man who'd abandoned her, and utterly, completely bored out of her mind with the smallness of her life. And then in walked Clyde, charming, quick-witted, dangerous in a way that felt exciting rather than threatening, a boy who talked about the world like it owed him something and he intended to collect. Witnesses who knew them both said it was instant. Something clicked between them immediately, an electricity that neither of them tried very hard to resist. Within weeks, they were inseparable. But here's the cruel twist that the movies always compress or skip entirely: Clyde was arrested almost immediately after they fell for each other. Just weeks into their romance, in February 1930, Clyde was picked up for a string of earlier burglaries and sent to jail. Bonnie, rather than walking away from a relationship that had barely begun, doubled down. She started visiting him constantly, and in one of the boldest moves of her young life, she smuggled a pistol into the jail, taped to her thigh or hidden in some accounts inside her clothing, allowing Clyde and another prisoner to escape. It didn't work out long-term. Clyde was recaptured within days in Ohio, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't a fling. Bonnie Parker was willing to break the law, personally and directly, for this man. She wasn't a bystander to Clyde's criminal life. From the very beginning, she was an active participant, an accomplice by choice, not by accident. Clyde was sentenced to serve time at Eastham Prison Farm, a brutal Texas penitentiary infamous even by the standards of Depression-era prisons for its forced labor, its violence, and the systemic abuse of inmates by both guards and other prisoners. And it was here, inside Eastham, that the boy who stole turkeys and joyrode stolen cars became something else entirely. Clyde was repeatedly and viciously sexually assaulted by a fellow inmate. Rather than receiving protection, he was essentially left to fend for himself in a system that treated inmates as expendable. Eventually, in an act of self-preservation and rage, Clyde killed the man who had been tormenting him, beating him to death with a lead pipe, according to most accounts, though for years the murder went unsolved and unattributed to Clyde specifically, since another inmate falsely confessed to protect him. This is the detail biographers and historians keep coming back to, because it explains so much of what came after. The Clyde who went into Eastham was a petty thief. The Clyde who came out was a man who had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the system would never protect him, that violence was simply the language the world spoke, and that he would need to speak it fluently if he wanted to survive. In a desperate bid to get transferred to lighter labor, Clyde even had another inmate chop off 2 of his toes with an axe. It didn't matter in the end. He received parole just days after the self-mutilation, a bitter, almost cosmic irony that would leave him with a limp for the rest of his short life. He walked out of Eastham in February 1932, and the people who knew him said he was unrecognizable. His mother reportedly said that prison had turned her son from a happy-go-lucky boy into someone bitter and hateful, someone who told his family, in no uncertain terms, that he would rather die than ever go back to prison again. That single sentence, that he would rather die than return, becomes the thesis statement for everything Bonnie and Clyde would do together over the next 2 years. Every gunfight, every high-speed chase, every reckless decision to shoot rather than surrender wasn't random bloodlust. It was a direct, traumatized response to what Eastham had done to him. He had decided, with total conviction, that death was preferable to capture, and he would spend the rest of his short life making that choice a reality, over and over, dragging the people he loved into the same fatal logic. Bonnie was waiting for him. In the months he'd been locked up, she hadn't drifted toward a safer life. If anything, the weight had hardened her resolve. She was done with waitressing, done with a marriage to a man who'd vanished, done with watching her mother's hands bleed over sewing machines for scraps. When Clyde walked free, Bonnie was there, and this time, there would be no separating them, not by prison walls, not by warnings from family, not by anything short of death itself. What followed almost immediately was a string of small robberies, grocery stores, gas stations, small-town banks that barely had enough cash in the vault to justify the risk. This wasn't yet the legendary crime spree of postcards and folk songs. This was desperate, chaotic, often poorly planned criminality carried out by a gang that formed loosely around Clyde and eventually included his brother Buck, Buck's wife Blanche, and a rotating cast of young men like Ray Hamilton and later W.D. Jones, a teenage neighbor from West Dallas who idolized Clyde and got swept into the gang almost by accident, a decision that would cost him dearly. The public image of Bonnie and Clyde as sophisticated bank robbers pulling off daring big city heists is, frankly, mostly fiction. The truth is messier and, in some ways, sadder. Most of their targets were small mom and pop stores and rural filling stations. The hauls were often pathetic, $20 here, $50 there. They were not criminal masterminds. They were young, impulsive, chronically broke, and increasingly willing to use violence when things went wrong, which they frequently did, because their planning was almost non-existent and their getaways relied more on Clyde's genuine talent for driving fast than any careful strategy. And things did go wrong, early and often. In April 1932, during a robbery in Kaufman County, Texas, Bonnie was actually captured and briefly jailed while Clyde escaped. She spent months in the Kaufman County jail, and this period is fascinating because it's one of the few times Bonnie was separated from the gang's violence and simply existed as herself, writing poetry in her cell, corresponding with Clyde, reportedly even charming some of her jailers. She was eventually released when a grand jury failed to indict her, and she went straight back to Clyde, no hesitation, no second-guessing. Whatever pull he had on her, whatever the two of them had found in each other, it was stronger than fear, stronger than the very real possibility of prison or death that she'd just tasted firsthand. By the summer of 1932, the gang's crimes escalated from robbery into homicide. In August, during a robbery attempt in Stringtown, Oklahoma, a confrontation with local law enforcement left a deputy sheriff dead. This was the first killing directly connected to the Barrow gang, and it changed everything. Robbery charges could be survived. Robbery charges meant prison, maybe parole eventually. But killing a law enforcement officer meant the full weight of the state would now be turned against them, permanently, without mercy, without any realistic path back to a normal life. From this point forward, Bonnie and Clyde weren't just outlaws. They were hunted. And yet, strangely, this is also the period where their public legend truly began to take shape, not because the press glorified them right away, but because of a roll of film. In the spring of 1933, following a shootout in Joplin, Missouri, that killed 2 police officers and forced the gang to flee so quickly they left behind personal belongings, police recovered several rolls of undeveloped film from the abandoned hideout. When developed, the photographs showed something the American public had never quite seen before: Bonnie and Clyde playfully posing with guns, laughing, embracing, and in one now iconic image, Bonnie standing with her foot on the bumper of a stolen car, a cigar clenched in her teeth, a pistol tucked into her waistband, staring down the camera with an expression that was equal parts mockery and pure, undiluted confidence. That single photograph exploded across newspapers nationwide. It was reprinted constantly, and it did something no press release or wanted poster ever could: it turned 2 desperate, violent fugitives into celebrities. Bonnie never actually smoked cigars regularly, she'd grabbed one as a prop for the photo. But the image was so striking, so provocative for its era, that it became inseparable from her identity. Americans in the depths of the Depression, watching banks foreclose on their farms and the wealthy seemingly untouched by the economic collapse, found something almost irresistibly appealing about two young outlaws thumbing their noses at authority and living, however briefly and however violently, entirely on their own terms. By the time this photograph hit newsstands, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer just names on a police blotter in rural Texas. They were becoming folklore in real time, a modern American myth assembling itself piece by piece out of bullet casings, stolen cars, and a nation's hunger for someone, anyone, who seemed to be beating the system that had broken so many of them. But myths have a cost, and the price for Bonnie and Clyde's growing fame was about to become measured in blood, their friends, their families, and eventually, inevitably, their own. We'll leave them here for now, two kids from the slums of Dallas, bound together by love and desperation, already marked men and women in the eyes of the law, their faces just beginning to appear in newspapers across the country. What comes next is darker, faster, and far bloodier, the shootouts, the betrayals, the brutal death of Buck Barrow, and the relentless manhunt that would eventually corner them on a lonely Louisiana road. By the autumn of 1933, the names Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were no longer whispered only in the sheriff's offices of rural Texas. They were being printed in bold type in newspapers from Dallas to Chicago, spoken about in diners and barbershops, feared by bank managers and small-town police chiefs alike. But behind the growing myth was a much uglier, more chaotic reality, a gang of young, undertrained, overarmed fugitives careening from one violent encounter to the next, running on adrenaline, paranoia, and an ever-shrinking list of places where they could safely rest. The romantic image the public was falling in love with bore almost no resemblance to the exhausted, hunted lives Bonnie and Clyde were actually living, sleeping in stolen cars on back roads, eating cold food out of cans, constantly checking rearview mirrors for headlights that might belong to a posse. The gang had grown beyond just Bonnie and Clyde by this point. Clyde's older brother Buck had been released from prison earlier that year, ironically, after receiving a full pardon following a petition partly influenced by his good behavior and the persuasive efforts of his wife, Blanche. Blanche Barrow was a preacher's daughter, refined and cautious by nature, utterly unlike Bonnie in temperament. She hated the criminal life almost from the moment she was pulled into it, and she would later describe those months on the run as something closer to a slow-motion nightmare than any kind of glamorous adventure. But love, or perhaps simple loyalty to her husband, kept her in the car anyway, riding alongside a gang that was accumulating bodies at an alarming rate. Rounding out the group was W.D. Jones, a teenager from the same West Dallas slum where Clyde had grown up. W.D. had known Clyde since childhood and idolized him the way a younger brother might idolize an older one, except Clyde wasn't just charismatic, he was already a killer, and W.D., barely out of his teens, would be pulled into violence far beyond anything he understood when he joined the gang. In later interviews, long after the smoke cleared, W.D. would describe those months with the Barrow gang not as thrilling but as terrifying, a blur of gunfire and fear that haunted him for the rest of his life. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a scared kid who got swept up in something enormous and deadly, and by the time he realized what he'd become part of, there was no clean way out. The gang's first major bloodbath as a full unit came in Joplin, Missouri, in April of 1933, the same incident that had produced the now famous photographs of Bonnie posing with her pistol and cigar. The gang had rented a garage apartment above a two-car garage in a residential neighborhood, hoping to lay low for a few weeks. But their behavior, coming and going oddly, carrying weapons openly, drinking heavily, and playing cards late into the night, attracted the attention of neighbors, who eventually reported them to the local police as suspected bootleggers. Local law enforcement, unaware they were about to stumble into one of the most wanted gangs in America, approached the garage expecting a routine liquor raid. What happened instead was chaos. As officers approached, Clyde and the gang opened fire almost immediately, unwilling to risk capture under any circumstances. Remember, Clyde had promised himself and his family that he would die before returning to a cell. In the firefight that followed, 2 law enforcement officers, a detective and a constable, were killed. The gang managed to escape in the confusion, but they left behind more than just casings and broken glass. In their haste, they abandoned personal belongings, letters, a saxophone Clyde apparently liked to play in quiet moments, poems written by Bonnie, and crucially, those undeveloped rolls of film. It's a strange, almost tragic detail that the objects revealing Bonnie's softer, more human side, her poetry, her attempt at ordinary hobbies, were left behind at the scene of a double homicide, forever binding her artistic, romantic nature to the violence that would come to define her public image. The Joplin shootout marked an important turning point. Before this, the gang's crimes, while serious, hadn't fully cemented Bonnie's personal culpability in the public eye. She hadn't been proven to have fired a weapon in a fatal encounter, and there remains genuine historical debate to this day about whether Bonnie ever personally killed anyone during the entire span of the gang's crime spree. Ballistics and witness testimony from later encounters suggest she may have fired weapons defensively, but conclusive proof that she personally killed a law enforcement officer has never been definitively established. And yet, in the public imagination, fueled by those photographs, by newspaper sensationalism, by the simple, irresistible narrative of a gun-toting woman defying the era's expectations of femininity, Bonnie became just as infamous, just as feared, just as wanted as Clyde himself. The mythology outran the facts almost immediately, and it's a distortion that persists in popular culture to this day. Following Joplin, the gang fled toward Texas, but their luck, already thin, was about to grow thinner. In June 1933, near Wellington, Texas, Clyde was driving too fast, as he often did, since speed was quite literally his primary survival strategy, and failed to notice a bridge under construction. The car plunged off the road and into a ravine, catching fire almost instantly. Bonnie, trapped in the wreckage, suffered horrific burns to her right leg, burns so severe that the muscle and skin were damaged down to the bone in places. For the rest of her short life, Bonnie would struggle to walk without assistance, often needing to be carried by Clyde or WD during the gang's frantic escapes. Witnesses who saw her in the following months described her hopping on one leg, wincing in obvious agony, sometimes needing morphine or whatever painkillers the gang could steal or scrounge to manage the pain. This detail rarely makes it into the romanticized retellings of the Bonnie and Clyde story, but it's essential to understanding the reality of those final 18 months. Bonnie wasn't gliding through her outlaw life with glamorous confidence. She was in near constant physical agony, dragging a mutilated leg through gunfights and getaways, held together by sheer stubborn will and, undeniably, by her devotion to Clyde. The accident should have slowed them down. It didn't. If anything, it accelerated the gang's descent into desperation and violence, because now they needed morphine, bandages, and medical supplies as urgently as they needed food and gasoline, and acquiring those things meant more robberies, more risk, more exposure. Shortly after the crash, in a moment of dark absurdity that shows just how chaotic their existence had become, the gang kidnapped a local town marshal and a highway patrolman near Wellington, holding them briefly before releasing them unharmed. It was almost a strange act of mercy amid the surrounding carnage, proof, perhaps, that Bonnie and Clyde weren't purely bloodthirsty, that there remained some flicker of restraint even as bodies piled up around them. But that restraint had limits, and those limits were tested again just weeks later in Platte City, Missouri. The gang had checked into a series of tourist cabins, trying once more to rest and let Bonnie's injuries heal. But their habit of paying for everything in coins, the result of small-time robberies that yielded little paper currency, combined with their bandaged, battle-worn appearance, drew suspicion from the cabin's owner, who alerted police. This time, law enforcement came prepared, arriving with an armored car, a rare and formidable piece of equipment for a rural Missouri police response in 1933. What followed was a ferocious gun battle. The gang, cornered but unwilling to surrender, fought their way out in a hail of gunfire, and remarkably, all of them escaped again, though Buck Barrow was shot in the head during the fight, a wound so severe that most who saw it assumed he would die within hours. He didn't. Buck, astonishingly, survived the initial wound, though grievously injured and clearly failing. The gang fled to Dexfield Park, an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa, hoping to find enough isolation to let Buck's wound and Bonnie's burns heal simultaneously. It was here, camped out in the overgrown ruins of what had once been a place of childhood joy and carnival lights, that the mythology of Bonnie and Clyde as untouchable outlaws finally began to crack under the weight of reality. Local residents noticed the group's suspicious presence and alerted authorities, and on July 24, 1933, a massive posse of local police, National Guardsmen, and armed citizens surrounded the park. The resulting battle was the most devastating the gang had yet endured. Buck Barrow, already dying from his head wound, was shot again multiple times. Blanche was blinded in one eye by flying glass from the windshield. In the chaos, Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. managed to escape on foot, but Buck and Blanche were both captured. Buck died 5 days later in a hospital, still technically in police custody, his body simply too damaged to survive what Platte City and Dexfield Park had done to it. Blanche would spend years in prison, permanently blinded in one eye, carrying physical and emotional scars from a criminal life she had never truly wanted any part of. For Clyde, Buck's death was a devastating blow, though he rarely, if ever, showed outward emotion about it to anyone outside his most immediate circle. Those who observed him in the weeks following Dexfield Park noted a new grimness in his demeanor, a kind of hardened fatalism that suggested Clyde now fully understood, on some visceral level, exactly how this story was going to end for him too. He wasn't naive. He knew the odds. Every police officer in 5 states was actively hunting him, and every encounter carried a real chance of death. And yet he kept going, kept driving, kept robbing small stores for gas money and grocery money, kept Bonnie by his side through it all, because the alternative, surrender, prison, the possibility of a return to Eastham or somewhere just as brutal, remained, in his mind, categorically worse than death. It was around this time that Bonnie's own family began to feel the mounting pressure and grief of loving someone the entire country now considered a monster. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, occasionally managed brief, clandestine visits with her daughter during rare quiet moments when the gang would risk sneaking back into the Dallas area to see family. These visits were fraught with tension and heartbreak. Emma repeatedly begged Bonnie to leave Clyde, to turn herself in, to take whatever punishment awaited her rather than continue down a path that could only end in death. Bonnie, according to family accounts, would cry during these conversations, would acknowledge that her mother was probably right, and would then, without fail, get back into the car with Clyde when it was time to leave. Whatever bond existed between them, it had become stronger than fear, stronger than family, stronger than Bonnie's own evident awareness that she was very likely driving toward her own death. It's worth pausing here to consider what, exactly, kept Bonnie tethered so completely to Clyde, especially given what we now understand about their relationship. Some historians have pointed to trauma bonding, the psychological phenomenon where extreme shared danger and dependency creates an almost unbreakable emotional attachment between people, particularly when one partner exhibits controlling or dominant behavioral patterns. Others have suggested it was simpler than that Bonnie, starved for excitement and meaning in a childhood and young adulthood defined by poverty and disappointment, found in Clyde a life that felt, however dangerous, more alive than anything Cement City or a waitressing job could ever offer her. She wrote poetry throughout this period. Several poems have survived, including one titled The Story of Suicide Sal, and, most famously, The Trail's End, a poem she wrote in the final months of her life that eerily, almost prophetically, described the death that awaited them both. These weren't the poems of a woman who was oblivious to her fate. They were the poems of someone who saw the ending clearly and chose, again and again, to keep walking toward it anyway, hand in hand with the man she loved. By early 1934, the gang, now reduced primarily to Bonnie, Clyde, and a rotating handful of associates including Ray Hamilton and later Henry Methvin, orchestrated what would become one of their most notorious and consequential acts, the Eastham prison break. In January 1934, Clyde organized and executed a daring raid on the very prison farm that had brutalized him years earlier, smuggling guns to inmates and orchestrating an armed breakout that freed several prisoners, including his old friend Ray Hamilton. During the escape, a prison guard named Major Joseph Crowson was shot and killed. This act was deeply personal for Clyde, a direct act of vengeance against the institution that had transformed him from a petty thief into a hardened, traumatized killer. But it also sealed his fate more completely than almost anything else he had done. Texas prison officials, embarrassed and enraged by the brazen breakout, made it their personal, singular mission to hunt Clyde Barrow down and end his life, whatever it took, however long it required. To lead this effort, Texas prison authorities brought in a retired Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer, a legendary lawman known for his relentless, almost obsessive dedication to his targets and his willingness to operate by his own rules when the situation demanded it. Hamer was not interested in another failed ambush, another shootout where Bonnie and Clyde escaped through sheer speed and audacity. He was interested in one outcome only, ending the chase permanently. Hamer began meticulously studying the gang's patterns, their preferred routes, the locations of their family members, the general geography of where they tended to circle back to when they needed rest or resupply. He was patient in a way that previous law enforcement responses had not been. He understood that Bonnie and Clyde's predictability, their loyalty to family, their tendency to return to familiar territory in Louisiana and Texas, would eventually be their undoing, if he simply waited for the right moment rather than chasing them reactively from ambush to ambush. Meanwhile, the gang's violence continued to escalate through the spring of 1934, seemingly with no capacity or willingness to slow down. In April, near Grapevine, Texas, Bonnie and Clyde encountered two young motorcycle patrolmen, Edward Bryant Wheeler and H.D. Murphy, on a rural highway. What exactly triggered the ensuing shootout remains debated by historians. Some accounts suggest the gang mistook the approaching officers for a threat and opened fire preemptively, panicked by the accumulated paranoia of months on the run. Other accounts suggest a more calculated ambush. Regardless of the precise trigger, both officers were killed in the encounter, and this incident, more than almost any other, permanently darkened the public's perception of Bonnie specifically. Witness reports, though later disputed and complicated by conflicting testimony, suggested that Bonnie had approached one of the wounded, dying officers and shot him again at close range, an act of brutal, merciless finality. Whether this specific detail is historically accurate remains genuinely contested. Some historians believe it was fabricated or exaggerated by a surviving witness eager to villainize Bonnie further, given the sensational press coverage such an act would generate. But true or not, the story spread like wildfire, and from that point forward, Bonnie Parker was no longer viewed by the public as merely Clyde's devoted girlfriend swept up in his violence. She was viewed as a co-equal, cold-blooded killer, every bit as dangerous and deserving of death as the man beside her. Just weeks later, in May 1934, the gang killed yet again, this time a constable named Cal Campbell near Commerce, Oklahoma, during a confrontation that also resulted in the gang briefly kidnapping the local police chief, who they later released unharmed after driving him some distance away, again demonstrating that strange, inconsistent thread of restraint amid escalating brutality. By this point, the death toll directly attributable to the Barrow gang had climbed into double digits, encompassing police officers, prison guards, and civilians caught in the crossfire of their increasingly desperate, increasingly cornered existence. The nation was no longer simply fascinated by Bonnie and Clyde. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were coordinating in ways rarely seen before, sharing intelligence, pooling resources, united by a singular, unrelenting purpose. These two young outlaws needed to be stopped, permanently, before they killed again. And Frank Hamer, watching from the shadows, patient and methodical, was closing in. He had identified a crucial vulnerability that Bonnie and Clyde, for all their cunning on the road, seemed either unable or unwilling to correct: their devotion to Henry Methvin's family in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Methvin, a relatively recent addition to the gang, had family roots in the area, and the gang had taken to using the rural Louisiana countryside as a hideout and resupply point, trusting the isolation and the loyalty of local associates. What Bonnie and Clyde didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Henry Methvin's father, under pressure and promises of leniency for his son from law enforcement, had begun quietly cooperating with Frank Hamer's manhunt, providing crucial details about the gang's movements and habits that would ultimately allow Hamer to set the trap that awaited them. By May 1934, the pieces were falling into place for an ending that both Bonnie and Clyde seemed to have long since accepted as inevitable, even as they continued driving, continued evading, continued clinging to whatever fragments of a life together they could steal from the jaws of a manhunt that had grown into one of the largest and most determined in American history. Bonnie's poem, The Trail's End, written in these final weeks, contained lines that read almost like a suicide note penned in advance, an acknowledgement that she knew, with total clarity, that death was close, and that she had made her peace with facing it alongside Clyde rather than living without him. We leave them here, in the tense, bloodied spring of 1934, a gang reduced to its founding 2 members, more wanted and more hunted than ever before, driving through the back roads of Louisiana toward a rendezvous point they didn't know had already been compromised. Frank Hamer and his posse were assembling. The trap was being set. And somewhere on a quiet stretch of road near Bienville Parish, the final chapter of Bonnie and Clyde's brief, blood-soaked love story was about to be written in gunfire. Frank Hamer did not believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in the kind of luck that had allowed Bonnie and Clyde to survive gunfight after gunfight, ambush after ambush, for nearly 2 years while dozens of law enforcement officers pursued them across half a dozen states. Hamer believed in patience, preparation, and the cold mathematics of inevitability. He had spent decades as a Texas Ranger building a reputation as a man who did not stop, did not tire, and did not accept failure as a permanent condition, only as a temporary delay before the next attempt. When the Texas Department of Corrections approached him in February 1934 and asked him to come out of retirement specifically to hunt down Bonnie and Clyde, Hamer initially resisted, not because he doubted his own abilities, but because he understood immediately the scale of what he was being asked to do. This wasn't going to be a quick arrest. This was going to be a manhunt requiring total dedication, possibly for months, chasing 2 fugitives who had already outmaneuvered dozens of law enforcement agencies, who had escaped ambushes that should have killed them, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural instinct for sensing danger and evading it at the last possible second. But Hamer accepted the assignment, and once he did, he approached it with the same methodical, obsessive focus that had defined his entire career. His first move was perhaps his smartest. He didn't chase Bonnie and Clyde. He studied them. He requested and received access to the accumulated case files from every law enforcement agency that had encountered the gang, poring over reports from Missouri, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas, looking not for the next ambush point but for patterns, recurring locations, recurring behaviors, recurring relationships. He wanted to understand Bonnie and Clyde not as 2 anonymous outlaws but as specific human beings with specific, predictable habits, because Hamer understood something that many of the previous pursuers had missed: fugitives on the run, no matter how careful, inevitably gravitate back toward the people and places that feel like home. Bonnie and Clyde, for all their violence and notoriety, were still deeply, almost stubbornly loyal to their families in Dallas and to a small handful of trusted associates scattered across Louisiana and Texas. That loyalty, Hamer recognized, was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. Hamer assembled a small, tightly controlled posse rather than a large, unwieldy force. He understood that Bonnie and Clyde's survival instincts were finely tuned to detect large groups of pursuers, and that a smaller, quieter team stood a better chance of getting close without triggering the gang's paranoia. His posse included Texas Ranger Manny Galt, along with several Louisiana and Texas law enforcement officers who had personal or professional stakes in ending the gang's rampage, including Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan and Deputy Prentice Oakley, men who knew the Louisiana back roads and rural communities better than any outsider possibly could. This local knowledge would prove absolutely essential, because Hamer's entire strategy hinged on exploiting exactly the kind of terrain and community relationships that only long-term local residents truly understood. The critical breakthrough came through Henry Methvin's family. Methvin, the newest and youngest member of the depleted Barrow gang, had joined Bonnie and Clyde following the chaos of Dexfield Park and the loss of Buck and Blanche Barrow to death and capture. Methvin's family lived in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, and the gang had increasingly relied on this rural, sparsely populated area as a refuge, a place to disappear into the pine forests and back roads when the heat from their most recent crimes grew too intense elsewhere. What Bonnie and Clyde apparently failed to fully appreciate was the immense psychological pressure that a life on the run, constantly one gunfight away from death, placed not just on themselves, but on everyone connected to them, including Henry Methvin's own family, who watched their son's involvement with the gang with escalating terror, understanding correctly that it was only a matter of time before he ended up dead or in prison for the rest of his life. Law enforcement approached Ivan Methvin, Henry's father, with an offer: cooperate in setting a trap for Bonnie and Clyde, and Henry would receive leniency, potentially even a pardon, for his role in the gang's crimes. For a father watching his son hurtle toward almost certain death, the choice, however agonizing, was clear. Ivan Methvin agreed to help. The plan that emerged was coldly, brutally simple in its construction, precisely because Hamer understood that anything too elaborate risked tipping off two fugitives who had survived this long specifically because of their heightened, almost paranoid awareness of danger. The Methvins' cooperation gave Hamer's posse a critical piece of intelligence. Bonnie and Clyde had a predictable, recurring pattern of visiting the Methvin family in Bienville Parish, and they would very likely be returning to the area again soon, given their established habits of moving in and out of the region every few weeks. Rather than trying to track the gang's constantly shifting movements across an enormous, unpredictable territory, Hamer's posse simply needed to identify the most likely route Bonnie and Clyde would take when approaching the Methvin residence and position themselves along it, waiting with the same patience Hamer had displayed throughout the entire operation. While Hamer's trap slowly assembled itself in the background, Bonnie and Clyde continued their existence exactly as they had for the better part of 2 years, a blur of stolen cars, brief visits with exhausted family members, small robberies conducted more out of desperate necessity than any grand criminal ambition, and constant, grinding vigilance against a world that had become uniformly hostile to their survival. By this point in the spring of 1934, the physical and psychological toll of their outlaw life had become impossible to hide, even from casual observers. Bonnie's leg, permanently damaged from the Wellington car accident nearly a year earlier, had never properly healed. She walked with a pronounced limp when she could walk unassisted at all, and in the final weeks of her life, witnesses recalled seeing her essentially carried or supported by Clyde during their movements in and out of vehicles. The chronic pain, combined with whatever makeshift pain management the gang could manage on the run, stolen morphine, improvised remedies, had visibly aged her far beyond her 23 years. Photographs and eyewitness accounts from this period describe a young woman who looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, and physically diminished compared to the vibrant, mischievous girl who had first caught Clyde's eye in a West Dallas kitchen 4 years earlier. Clyde, too, showed the wear of relentless pursuit. Those who encountered him during this period described a man who rarely slept for more than a few hours at a stretch, who kept weapons within arm's reach at all times, even during quiet family visits, and who had developed an almost mechanical efficiency in his movements, checking mirrors, scanning horizons, calculating escape routes before he'd even fully settled into a location. This wasn't paranoia in the clinical sense. It was, by 1934, an entirely rational response to a reality where literally every law enforcement agency across multiple states was actively hunting him, where any random encounter with a police officer, no matter how routine it might have seemed to an outside observer, carried the very real possibility of ending in gunfire and death. And yet, remarkably, amid all this accumulated trauma and exhaustion, Bonnie and Clyde continued to maintain something resembling ordinary human relationships and behaviors. They visited family whenever they safely could, sneaking into the outskirts of Dallas for brief, tearful reunions with parents and siblings who lived in constant, gnawing fear that each visit might be the last time they ever saw their children alive. Bonnie continued writing poetry throughout this period, an activity that seems almost jarringly gentle and reflective given the surrounding violence, but which likely served as one of the only outlets she had for processing the trauma, fear, and complicated emotions of a life she had chosen and now could not escape even if she wanted to. Her poem, The Trail's End, composed in these final weeks, remains one of the most studied and analyzed pieces of writing connected to the entire Bonnie and Clyde saga, precisely because of how eerily, deliberately prophetic it reads. In it, she wrote about the inevitability of their capture and death, about the public's fascination with their story, about her own awareness that history would remember them, for better or worse, long after they were gone. She wasn't naive about her fate. She saw it clearly, and in her own words, she made a kind of peace with it, framing her death alongside Clyde not as a tragedy to be avoided but as an outcome she had, in some fundamental sense, already accepted as the price of the love and loyalty that had defined the last 4 years of her short life. It's worth pausing here to consider Clyde's state of mind during these final weeks as well, because history has often flattened him into a simple archetype, the cold, violent gangster, the reckless criminal mastermind, when the actual historical record suggests something more complicated and, in its own way, more tragic. Family members who saw Clyde during his final visits home described a man who seemed simultaneously resigned to his fate and desperate to protect the people he loved from the consequences of his choices. He reportedly urged his family, repeatedly, to distance themselves from him publicly, understanding that his notoriety put them at constant risk of harassment, surveillance, and potential legal jeopardy simply for being related to him. There's a particular poignancy in imagining Clyde Barrow, a man responsible, directly or indirectly, for over a dozen deaths by this point, a man who had become one of the most feared and hated fugitives in American history, spending his final weeks worrying not primarily about his own survival, which he had long since accepted as unlikely, but about shielding his mother, his siblings, and Bonnie's family from the fallout of everything he had done. Throughout April and into May of 1934, Frank Hamer's posse continued their patient surveillance, gathering intelligence through the Methvin family about the gang's likely movements and patterns. The plan crystallized around a specific, carefully chosen location, a stretch of rural highway near Sales, Louisiana, in Bienville Parish, close to the Methvin family home, a road the posse believed Bonnie and Clyde would very likely travel given their established habits of visiting the area. Hamer's strategy was ruthlessly pragmatic, shaped entirely by hard-won experience of just how dangerous and unpredictable Bonnie and Clyde had proven to be in every previous encounter with law enforcement. He had no interest in attempting an arrest, no interest in calling out warnings or giving the gang any opportunity to reach for weapons or attempt an escape. Hamer had studied enough failed ambushes, enough shootouts where officers had been killed or gravely wounded because they'd hesitated, because they'd tried to follow standard arrest procedures with fugitives who had already demonstrated, repeatedly and violently, that they would shoot their way out of any situation rather than surrender. This time, there would be no hesitation, no warning, no opportunity for Bonnie and Clyde to reach for the small arsenal of weapons they kept within immediate reach at all times. On the early morning of May 23, 1934, Hamer's posse, now consisting of 6 men including Hamer himself, Manny Galt, Bob Alcorn, Ted Hinton, Sheriff Henderson Jordan, and Deputy Prentice Oakley, took up concealed positions along the predetermined stretch of highway, hidden in the underbrush and trees lining the road, weapons ready, waiting for a vehicle they had every reason to believe would appear sometime that morning, based on the intelligence gathered through Ivan Methvin. The wait, characteristically for this entire operation, required exactly the kind of patience Hamer had built his reputation on. The posse remained in position for hours, motionless, silent, watching the empty road stretch out before them in the pale early morning light, uncertain exactly when, or even definitively if, their targets would appear. What none of the men waiting in that Louisiana underbrush could have fully appreciated, despite their meticulous planning and their accumulated knowledge of Bonnie and Clyde's patterns, was the strange, almost unbearable weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't going to be a fair fight, a standard confrontation between armed pursuers and armed fugitives with some theoretical possibility of surrender or negotiation. This was going to be an execution, carefully planned and coldly executed, justified entirely by the overwhelming, well-documented danger that Bonnie and Clyde had proven themselves to represent over the previous 2 years. Whether that justification was morally sufficient, whether 2 young people, however violent and dangerous, deserved to be gunned down without warning rather than given any opportunity to surrender, remains a question that historians, ethicists, and casual observers of the Bonnie and Clyde legend have debated for nearly a century since. But in the moment, on that quiet Louisiana morning, Hamer and his men weren't concerned with philosophical questions about justice and due process. They were concerned with ending, permanently and definitively, a killing spree that had already claimed far too many lives, and they were prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow would never again escape, never again vanish into the pine forests and back roads that had sheltered them for so long. As the morning stretched on, tension among the waiting posse members grew, each man privately wondering whether their intelligence had been accurate, whether Bonnie and Clyde would actually appear on this particular stretch of road on this particular morning, or whether months of careful planning were about to unravel into another failed attempt, another near miss in a manhunt that had already consumed enormous resources and produced nothing but frustration and additional casualties. The posse had positioned Ivan Methvin's truck along the roadside as a kind of lure and pretext, the idea being that Bonnie and Clyde, seeing a familiar vehicle belonging to trusted associates, would slow down or stop, providing the posse with a clear, close-range opportunity that would eliminate any chance of the fugitives escaping through their usual combination of speed and evasive driving. Somewhere beyond the tree line, unaware that the largest and most carefully orchestrated manhunt of their entire criminal career had finally converged on this single, quiet stretch of Louisiana highway, Bonnie and Clyde continued driving, continued living out what remained of their brief, doomed partnership, utterly unaware that within hours, everything, the poetry, the violence, the desperate love that had bound them together since that first meeting in a West Dallas kitchen 4 years earlier, was about to end in a single, overwhelming burst of gunfire that would echo across American history for generations to come. We'll pause here, on the edge of that final morning, with Hamer's posse hidden and waiting, weapons ready, and Bonnie and Clyde somewhere out on the road, driving steadily and unknowingly toward the end of everything they had built together. The morning of May 23, 1934, began the way so many mornings had begun for Bonnie and Clyde over the previous 2 years, quietly, cautiously, with the particular vigilance that had become as natural to them as breathing. They had spent the previous night, according to most historical reconstructions, at a rooming house or campsite not far from Bienville Parish, having come into the area to meet with Henry Methvin and his father, unaware that this very meeting had been engineered, in a sense, by the posse now waiting for them along the highway. Clyde was driving, as he almost always did. He loved driving, loved the feeling of speed and control, had once even written an admiring letter to Henry Ford praising the reliability of Ford the Fifth 8 engines for exactly the kind of high-speed evasive driving his outlaw life required. Bonnie sat beside him in the passenger seat, her injured leg no doubt still causing her considerable discomfort, a paper bag of sandwiches on her lap, purchased or acquired during their travels, a small, mundane detail that stands in almost unbearable contrast to what was about to happen. They were driving a stolen 1934 Ford the Fifth 8 sedan, tan-colored, the same model Clyde favored throughout his criminal career precisely because of its combination of speed and relative reliability compared to the law enforcement vehicles of the era, which often struggled to match the performance of the very same commercially available cars that outlaws like Clyde had learned to steal and maintain with real mechanical skill. Inside the car, along with Bonnie and Clyde themselves, was an arsenal that reflected just how thoroughly their entire existence had become organized around the possibility, indeed the near certainty, of violent confrontation, multiple rifles, semi-automatic weapons, handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition, along with a small number of personal possessions that told a quieter, sadder story about who these two young people actually were underneath the mythology, Bonnie's saxophone sheet. Music, letters from family, and reportedly that fateful poem, The Trail's End, tucked away among her belongings. As Clyde's Ford approached the predetermined stretch of Highway 154 near Sales, Louisiana, he would have seen, up ahead, Ivan Methvin's truck parked along the roadside, seemingly broken down or stopped for some ordinary, unremarkable reason. To Clyde, who had built a working relationship of trust with the Methvin family over recent months, this would have registered as nothing alarming, perhaps even an opportunity to briefly check in, to see if Henry's father needed assistance, consistent with the loose, informal network of loyalty and mutual aid that had helped sustain the gang's survival for so long. He began to slow the car, exactly as Hamer and his posse had anticipated and planned for, easing off the accelerator as he approached the parked truck, perhaps preparing to stop entirely, perhaps simply preparing to idle past at a reduced speed while assessing the situation. It was at this moment, as the Ford slowed to a crawl along that quiet rural highway, surrounded by dense Louisiana pine forest, that Hamer's posse opened fire, without warning, without any call for surrender, without any of the theatrical confrontation that popular films and folklore would later attach to the event. The reality was starkly, brutally simple: 6 armed men, positioned in concealed locations along both sides of the road, unleashed a devastating, sustained barrage of rifle and shotgun fire directly into the slowing vehicle the instant it came within range. Estimates of the total number of rounds fired during the ambush vary depending on the historical source, but most accounts place the figure somewhere between 130 and 170 rounds fired in the span of well under 2 minutes, an almost unimaginable concentration of gunfire directed at a single vehicle occupied by exactly 2 people. Clyde Barrow was killed essentially instantly, struck by a fatal head wound in the opening moments of the ambush, his body slumping over the steering wheel as the car, no longer under any meaningful control, rolled forward briefly before coming to a stop in the roadside ditch. Bonnie, according to forensic reconstructions and witness accounts from the posse members themselves, appears to have survived Clyde by mere seconds, her body absorbing dozens of additional rounds as the gunfire continued even after any realistic threat the couple could have posed had already been eliminated by Clyde's near-instantaneous death. This detail, the sheer volume of continued gunfire directed at Bonnie's body even after resistance had become impossible, has fueled ongoing debate and discomfort among historians and ethicists studying the event, raising uncomfortable but legitimate questions about whether the ambush, however justified by the gang's documented history of violence, crossed some meaningful line between necessary law enforcement action and something closer to an execution carried out with excessive, almost punitive force. When the gunfire finally ceased and Hamer's posse cautiously approached the wrecked, bullet-riddled Ford, they found a scene of almost incomprehensible carnage. Later examinations would reveal that Bonnie's body alone had been struck by approximately 50 rounds, while Clyde's body bore a similarly devastating number of wounds. The vehicle itself was so thoroughly perforated by gunfire that reporters and law enforcement officials who later viewed it struggled to find any surface of the car's exterior that hadn't been struck at least once. Inside the wreckage, alongside the bodies, investigators found the substantial arsenal of weapons the couple had been carrying, along with more personal, human artifacts, that bag of sandwiches, still sitting where Bonnie had placed it before the shooting began, and reportedly a pack of Bonnie's cigarettes, further complicating the popular mythology of the cigar-smoking outlaw woman that the earlier Joplin photographs had helped create. News of the ambush and the deaths of Bonnie and Clyde spread with extraordinary speed, first through law enforcement channels and then, almost immediately, through national newspaper wire services, transforming what had been a relatively contained rural Louisiana ambush into a nationwide media sensation within hours. And what followed the initial shock of the news was, in its own way, almost as disturbing as the ambush itself. A macabre, chaotic scene developed at the site of the shooting almost immediately, as word spread locally and curious onlookers, souvenir hunters, and eventually a massive crowd of spectators descended on the crash site before the bodies had even been properly removed. Accounts from the scene describe people attempting to cut pieces of clothing or hair from the bodies as grim souvenirs, others attempting to dip handkerchiefs in the blood pooling around the wrecked vehicle, a disturbing testament to just how thoroughly Bonnie and Clyde's outlaw celebrity had penetrated the public imagination, transforming even their brutal, bloody deaths into a kind of dark spectacle that onlookers seemed almost eager to participate in and claim some physical connection to. The bodies were eventually transported, first to a funeral home in Arcadia, Louisiana, where crowds numbering in the thousands reportedly gathered outside, hoping for a glimpse of the now legendary outlaws, even in death. The local funeral home, utterly unprepared for the scale of public interest, struggled to manage the crowds, and law enforcement had to be called in simply to maintain order around a building that had never anticipated hosting what amounted to an impromptu, morbid public viewing for 2 of the most notorious criminals in American history. From Arcadia, the bodies were eventually transported back to Dallas, where separate funerals were held for Bonnie and Clyde. Their families, despite the couple's shared fate and shared legend, had specifically requested separate services, a detail that speaks to lingering tensions and complicated feelings among the Parker and Barrow families about the relationship that had ultimately led both young people to such violent, premature deaths. Bonnie's funeral, held on May 26, 1934, drew a crowd estimated at somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people, an almost unfathomable turnout for the funeral of a 23-year-old woman who, whatever her crimes, had been just a few years earlier an ordinary, anonymous waitress in Cement City, Texas. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, reportedly moved through the funeral in a state of profound grief and, according to some accounts, barely suppressed anger not necessarily at her daughter, whom she continued to love despite everything, but perhaps at the entire trajectory of events, the poverty and desperation that had shaped Bonnie's early life, the relationship with Clyde that had consumed her daughter so completely, and the massive crowds of strangers who seemed to be treating her daughter's death as a form of entertainment rather than the genuine tragedy it represented for the family left behind. Bonnie was buried, per her family's wishes and contrary to her own occasionally expressed wish to be buried beside Clyde, in a separate cemetery, under a headstone that reads, poignantly, "As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you," a sentimental epitaph that stands in almost jarring contrast to the violence and notoriety that had defined the final years of her short life. Clyde's funeral, held around the same time, drew similarly massive crowds, though perhaps slightly smaller than the turnout for Bonnie's service, and his family, too, grappled with the strange, uncomfortable reality of burying a son who had become simultaneously a folk hero to millions of struggling, disillusioned Americans and one of the most reviled, feared criminals in the nation's recent history. Clyde's brother Buck, of course, had already died the previous year following the Dexfield Park shootout, meaning the Barrow family had now lost two sons to the same escalating spiral of violence and desperation within the span of just 12 months, a devastating toll that the surviving family members would carry for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush, questions and controversy began to swirl almost instantly around the exact circumstances and justification for how Bonnie and Clyde had been killed. Frank Hamer and his fellow posse members were, in many quarters, celebrated as heroes who had finally ended a killing spree that had claimed at least 9 law enforcement officers' lives along with several civilians, a body count that, by any reasonable standard, justified an aggressive, decisive response from law enforcement. But even in 1934, amid the initial wave of public relief and celebration that the manhunt had finally concluded, uncomfortable questions lingered about the specific tactics employed during the ambush itself. The complete absence of any warning, any opportunity for surrender, any attempt to apprehend the couple through less lethal means, struck some observers, even at the time, as excessive, as something closer to a coldly premeditated execution than a legitimate law enforcement action. However dangerous and violent the targets of that action had proven themselves to be over the preceding 2 years. This tension, between viewing the ambush as necessary, justified law enforcement action against two proven, prolific killers, versus viewing it as an excessive, almost vengeful execution carried out without due process, has persisted in historical and popular discussions of the Bonnie and Clyde story for nearly a century since. It's a tension that speaks to broader, unresolved questions about the proper limits of law enforcement violence, about the moral distinctions between capturing and killing even genuinely dangerous fugitives, and about how a society should balance the demonstrated need for decisive action against career criminals with basic principles of due process and the right to surrender, even for individuals who have committed grievous, well-documented crimes. What's often lost in the more sensationalized, romanticized retellings of the Bonnie and Clyde legend is the sheer scale of grief and loss that radiated outward from that single Louisiana highway ambush, extending far beyond just the two central figures themselves. 9 law enforcement officers had lost their lives over the course of the gang's roughly 2-year crime spree, each one leaving behind grieving families, colleagues, and communities who had to process the loss of husbands, fathers, sons, and friends killed in the line of duty by two fugitives who had, in the popular press, been increasingly romanticized as folk heroes rather than the violent, desperate killers that these officers' families understood them to actually be. Prison guard Major Joseph Crowson, killed during the Eastham breakout, left behind his own family and community grieving a death that received far less national attention and sympathy than the deaths of Bonnie and Clyde themselves would eventually receive. Similarly, the Barrow and Parker families, whatever their complicated feelings about their children's criminal activities, were left to process not just grief but also the strange, disorienting experience of watching their private family tragedy transform into a massive public spectacle, their children's deaths dissected and debated in newspapers nationwide, their family names permanently and inextricably linked to one of the most notorious criminal partnerships in American history. Blanche Barrow, Buck's widow, blinded in one eye during the Dexfield Park shootout and sentenced to prison for her role in the gang's activities, would spend years grappling with a form of trauma and loss that received comparatively little public sympathy or attention, her own suffering overshadowed by the larger, more mythologized narrative of Bonnie and Clyde's doomed romance. W.D. Jones, the young man who had been essentially a teenager when he was pulled into the gang's orbit through his childhood connection to Clyde, eventually surrendered to authorities and gave extensive interviews and testimony describing his time with the gang not as an exciting criminal adventure but as a period of near-constant terror, trauma, and regret. His account, delivered years after the ambush, offers one of the more sobering, unglamorized perspectives on the actual lived experience of being part of Bonnie and Clyde's gang, describing sleepless nights, constant fear, and a profound sense of having been swept into something far larger and more destructive than he had ever truly understood or consented to as a teenager who simply idolized an older, charismatic figure from his own impoverished neighborhood. In the days and weeks following the ambush, as the shock of Bonnie and Clyde's deaths rippled across the country, a strange and telling transformation began to occur in how the American public processed and made sense of what had happened. Rather than settling into a simple narrative of justice finally served against two dangerous killers, the story of Bonnie and Clyde's deaths became almost immediately entangled with deeper, more complicated cultural anxieties and fascinations tied to the era's economic devastation, its widespread disillusionment with traditional institutions of authority, and its complicated, ambivalent relationship with figures who seemed to openly defy a system that had failed so many ordinary Americans. During the Great Depression, Bonnie and Clyde, in death, became something larger than the historical facts of their actual lives and crimes could fully contain. They became a symbol, a canvas onto which an anxious, economically devastated nation projected its own complicated feelings about poverty, rebellion, love, violence, and the American dream's apparent failure to deliver on its promises for millions of citizens like the Barrow and Parker families. This transformation from historical fact into cultural mythology would continue to evolve and intensify over the following decades, eventually giving rise to Hollywood films, popular songs, works of literature, and eventually, generations later, even video game characters and settings that drew direct inspiration from the aesthetic and narrative elements of the Bonnie and Clyde story, the doomed young lovers, the getaway cars, the defiant violence against a system perceived as fundamentally unjust, the sense of two people choosing to live fast and dangerously rather than accept the slow, grinding poverty that had defined their earlier lives. But in May of 1934, standing at that bullet-riddled Ford sedan on a quiet Louisiana highway, none of that future mythology had yet taken shape. There was only the immediate, visceral reality of two young lives violently ended, a manhunt finally concluded, and a nation left to grapple with exactly what it meant that so many ordinary Americans had found themselves, however uncomfortably, rooting for two killers simply because they represented, however imperfectly and violently, a certain desperate defiance against a world that had offered them nothing but poverty and hardship from the very beginning. We'll pause the story here, with the smoke barely cleared from that Louisiana ambush and the nation just beginning to absorb the shocking, bloody conclusion to America's most notorious outlaw love story. What comes next moves beyond the immediate aftermath and into the deeper investigation of who Bonnie and Clyde truly were beneath the myth, the complicated legacy they left behind, and how their story would eventually transform into the cultural touchstone that continues to influence American storytelling nearly a century later. To truly understand who Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were, it's necessary to strip away nearly a century of accumulated mythology, the movies, the songs, the romanticized outlaw imagery, and look instead at what the historical record, the surviving letters, the forensic evidence, and the testimonies of people who actually knew them reveal about two deeply human, deeply flawed young people who were shaped as much by circumstance and trauma as by any inherent criminal nature. This is perhaps the most difficult but most necessary task in telling their story honestly, because the Bonnie and Clyde of popular imagination, glamorous, cunning, almost invincible in their defiance of authority, bears only a partial, distorted resemblance to the exhausted, injured, frightened young people who actually lived and died on those Depression-era back roads. Start with the economic and social context that produced them, because it's impossible to understand Bonnie and Clyde's choices without understanding the world that shaped those choices in the first place. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of October 1929, devastated the American economy with a completeness that's difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had reached roughly 25%, meaning 1 in 4 American workers had no job whatsoever, and this figure doesn't even begin to capture the additional millions who were underemployed, working reduced hours for reduced wages, or trapped in the kind of precarious tenant farming arrangements that had defined Clyde's childhood. Banks failed by the thousands, wiping out the life savings of ordinary families who had trusted those institutions with their money. Farms failed across the country, exacerbated in the Great Plains by the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, forcing millions of families into the kind of desperate, itinerant existence that had brought both the Barrow and Parker families to the fringes of Dallas in the first place. In this context, the popular fascination with Bonnie and Clyde takes on a more complicated, more understandable dimension than simple bloodlust or celebrity worship. Banks, in particular, had become symbols of everything that had gone wrong in American economic life, institutions that had encouraged ordinary families to trust them with their savings, only to fail catastrophically and wipe out those same families' financial security, all while wealthy bankers and financiers seemed to escape the crisis relatively unscathed. When newspapers reported on Bonnie and Clyde's robberies, even though the vast majority of their targets were actually small grocery stores and gas stations rather than banks, the popular imagination nonetheless cast them in the role of folk heroes striking back against exactly the kind of powerful, seemingly untouchable institutions that had failed so many ordinary Americans. This is, of course, a deeply flawed and factually inaccurate framing. Bonnie and Clyde's victims were overwhelmingly small business owners, working-class store clerks, and law enforcement officers, not the wealthy bankers and financiers who had actually caused the broader economic catastrophe. But mythology rarely concerns itself with precise factual accuracy, and the emotional resonance of two young, poor, defiant outlaws thumbing their noses at authority proved far more powerful, in the popular imagination, than the messier, more uncomfortable reality of their actual crimes and victims. It's also worth examining more carefully the psychological dimensions of both Bonnie's and Clyde's personalities, drawing on the substantial historical record that survives from letters, poetry, witness testimony, and the accounts of family members who knew them intimately before and during their criminal careers. Clyde, as established earlier in this story, underwent what modern psychological frameworks would almost certainly classify as severe, unresolved trauma during his imprisonment at Eastham Prison Farm, the sexual assault he endured, the violence he was forced to commit in response, and the broader brutality of the Texas prison system's forced labor camps in this era. Modern trauma research consistently demonstrates that experiences of this severity, particularly when combined with a complete absence of institutional support or protection, can produce exactly the kind of hardened, hypervigilant, violence-normalized psychological state that multiple family members and associates observed in Clyde following his release from Eastham. His statement to his family that he would rather die than return to prison wasn't simply outlaw bravado, it reflected, in psychological terms, a genuine and understandable terror of re-experiencing trauma so severe that death had become, in his calculation, the objectively preferable alternative. This isn't offered as an excuse or justification for the violence Clyde subsequently inflicted on others, the law enforcement officers, prison guards, and civilians who died at his hands or under his direction were just as dead, their families just as devastated, regardless of the trauma that had shaped Clyde's psychology. But understanding this context does help explain, in human rather than purely mythological terms, why Clyde behaved as he did during his final 2 years, why he consistently chose violent confrontation over any possibility of surrender, and why he seemed, according to multiple witnesses, to approach his own likely death with a kind of grim, fatalistic acceptance rather than genuine fear. Bonnie's psychology presents a somewhat different, though equally complex, picture. Unlike Clyde, Bonnie had genuine intellectual and creative gifts that were recognized even in her impoverished school environment. Her academic achievements, her evident talent for writing, her natural charisma and dramatic flair all suggested a young woman who, under different economic circumstances, might have pursued education, writing, or performance as legitimate career paths. Her early marriage to Roy Thornton at 16, followed by his abandonment and her subsequent work as a waitress, reflects the extremely limited options available to a working-class young woman in 1920s Texas, regardless of her individual talents or intelligence. When Clyde entered her life, he didn't just offer romantic excitement, he offered, however perversely and dangerously, a form of agency and purpose that Bonnie's legitimate economic and social options had entirely failed to provide. This dynamic, historians and psychologists studying the case have noted, bears certain resemblances to patterns now better understood through modern research into trauma bonding and the psychology of individuals, often women, who become deeply attached to partners engaged in dangerous or criminal behavior. It's a complex psychological phenomenon, not reducible to simple explanations of naivety or moral failing, and it helps explain why Bonnie, despite repeated opportunities to separate herself from Clyde and despite her own family's desperate pleas for her to do exactly that, remained committed to their relationship even as it became increasingly clear that this commitment would very likely cost her life. The forensic and ballistic evidence gathered following the ambush and analyzed extensively by historians in the decades since offers additional, important nuance to the popular mythology surrounding Bonnie specifically. Despite the widespread public perception, fueled by sensationalized press coverage and the enduring image of Bonnie posing with a pistol and cigar, definitive forensic evidence that Bonnie personally killed anyone during the entire span of the gang's crime spree remains, to this day, genuinely disputed among historians. Some ballistic and witness evidence suggests she may have fired weapons during various confrontations, potentially in self-defense or in support of Clyde and other gang members during shootouts, but the specific, oft-repeated claim that she executed a wounded officer at close range during the Grapevine, Texas shootout in April 1934 relies heavily on witness testimony that has been challenged and complicated by conflicting accounts and by the broader context of how eager contemporary press coverage was to villainize Bonnie in increasingly sensationalized, and not always strictly accurate, terms. This isn't to suggest Bonnie was some kind of innocent bystander swept unwillingly into Clyde's violence. The substantial historical record makes clear that she was a fully willing, active participant in the gang's criminal activities, that she armed herself, that she participated in robberies and evaded law enforcement alongside Clyde with full knowledge and apparent acceptance of the risks and moral weight of what they were doing together. But the specific mythology of Bonnie as a particularly bloodthirsty, cold-blooded killer, distinct from and perhaps even exceeding Clyde's own documented violence, appears to be significantly more a product of sensationalized 1930s press coverage, eager to capitalize on the novelty and shock value of a young woman participating so visibly in violent crime, than a reflection of clearly established historical fact. The broader gang dynamics also merit deeper examination than the popular Bonnie and Clyde as a duo narrative typically allows. As established throughout this story, the actual criminal enterprise involved a rotating cast of additional participants, Buck and Blanche Barrow, W.D. Jones, Ray Hamilton, Henry Methvin, and others, whose individual stories and motivations add important complexity to the broader narrative. Blanche Barrow's experience, in particular, offers a crucial counterpoint to the romanticized outlaw narrative. Blanche, a preacher's daughter who had married into the criminal life through her relationship with Buck rather than actively choosing it herself, spent years in prison following the Dexfield Park shootout, permanently blinded in one eye, having lost her husband to the same violence that had claimed so many others connected to the gang. Her own memoirs and later interviews, given years after her release from prison, offer a starkly unromantic perspective on life within the Barrow gang, describing constant fear, deprivation, and trauma rather than any of the glamour or excitement that popular culture would later attach to the Bonnie and Clyde legend. Blanche, notably, expressed considerable resentment in later years toward how popular films and books had romanticized and distorted the actual, traumatic reality of what she and the other gang members had actually experienced during those chaotic, violent months on the run. W.D. Jones's account offers similarly important correction to the popular mythology. Jones, barely out of his teens when he was drawn into the gang through his childhood familiarity with Clyde, described in later interviews and testimony a experience defined overwhelmingly by terror rather than excitement or purpose. He recounted sleepless nights, constant fear of imminent death, and a profound sense of having been swept into circumstances far beyond his own understanding or control as a teenager who had simply idolized an older, charismatic neighborhood figure without any real comprehension of what that admiration would eventually cost him. Jones eventually served time in prison for his role in the gang's activities, and his subsequent life, by most historical accounts, was marked by ongoing struggles with the psychological aftermath of his time with Bonnie and Clyde, offering yet another sobering counterpoint to any narrative that frames involvement with the gang as glamorous or exciting rather than genuinely traumatic and destructive. It's also worth examining, in this deeper dive beneath the mythology, the specific role that press coverage and popular media played in constructing the Bonnie and Clyde legend even while the couple was still alive and actively committing crimes. The recovered photographs from the Joplin, Missouri hideout in 1933, particularly the now iconic image of Bonnie with her foot on a car bumper, cigar in her teeth, pistol at her waist, represent perhaps the single most consequential piece of visual media in the entire history of American outlaw mythology, precisely because of how thoroughly that image, reproduced constantly across national newspapers, shaped public perception of Bonnie specifically as a bold, defiant, almost theatrically confident criminal figure. What's often lost in discussions of this photograph is how essentially incidental and unplanned it actually was. Bonnie had grabbed a cigar as a playful prop for what was, in its original context, simply a private, informal photograph taken by gang members for their own amusement, never intended for public consumption. The transformation of this private, somewhat playful image into a defining, nationally recognized symbol of criminal defiance illustrates something important about how mythology gets constructed, often through essentially arbitrary or accidental details that happen to capture public imagination in ways their original creators never anticipated or intended. The broader press coverage of Bonnie and Clyde throughout their crime spree similarly reveals important patterns about how 1930s media culture, still relatively young in terms of national wire service distribution and mass-market newspaper circulation, contributed directly to constructing and amplifying the outlaw mythology that would eventually eclipse the more complicated, more human historical reality. Newspapers competed intensely for readership during this era, and sensationalized coverage of crime, violence, and colorful criminal personalities proved reliably effective at driving circulation and reader engagement. Bonnie and Clyde, with their youth, their romantic relationship, and their willingness to pose for photographs that humanized and even glamorized their criminal lifestyle, provided exactly the kind of compelling, narratively rich material that competing newspapers eagerly seized upon and amplified, often prioritizing dramatic, engaging storytelling over strict factual precision. This dynamic, sensationalized media coverage transforming complicated, morally ambiguous historical figures into simplified, mythologized symbols, obviously extends far beyond just the Bonnie and Clyde story, but their case represents one of the clearest, most thoroughly documented examples of this process occurring in real time, with each new photograph, each new dramatic newspaper account, incrementally building a public mythology that increasingly diverged from the actual, more mundane and more tragic reality of two young, traumatized, economically desperate people making a series of increasingly violent and ultimately fatal choices under the crushing weight of circumstances that had offered them very few legitimate alternatives from the very beginning of their lives. Understanding Bonnie and Clyde as fully realized historical figures, rather than as simplified mythological archetypes, requires holding multiple, seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. They were, without question, dangerous, violent criminals directly responsible for the deaths of numerous law enforcement officers and civilians, individuals whose actions caused genuine, devastating harm to real families and communities across multiple states. And simultaneously, they were also two young, deeply traumatized, economically desperate individuals whose criminal trajectory emerged from a combination of grinding poverty, institutional brutality, and a society that had offered them remarkably few legitimate paths toward the kind of dignity, purpose, and economic security that most human beings reasonably desire. Neither of these truths cancels out or diminishes the other. Bonnie and Clyde can be simultaneously understood as genuine perpetrators of serious violence and as products of circumstances that, while never excusing that violence, help explain and contextualize how two ordinary, working-class young people from Dallas's poorest neighborhoods came to occupy such an extraordinary, mythologized place in American cultural history. This complexity, this refusal to fit neatly into either purely heroic or purely villainous categories, may ultimately explain why the Bonnie and Clyde story has proven so durable, so consistently compelling to successive generations of American audiences across nearly a century since their deaths. They occupy a particular, uncomfortable space in the national imagination, neither purely admirable nor purely condemnable, but rather deeply, messily human in ways that resist the kind of simple moral categorization that popular culture typically prefers when constructing its heroes and villains. It's precisely this complexity, This resistance to easy categorization, that has allowed the Bonnie and Clyde legend to remain culturally relevant and adaptable across dramatically different eras and mediums, from the immediate newspaper sensationalism of the 1930s through Hollywood's various cinematic interpretations in subsequent decades, and eventually into 21st-century video game culture, where their basic narrative template, young, poor, defiant lovers pushing back against a system that failed them, even through increasingly violent and ultimately self-destructive means, continues to resonate with audiences facing their own contemporary anxieties about economic inequality, institutional failure, and the elusive promise of the American dream. We'll pause here, having moved beneath the surface mythology to examine the more complicated, more human historical reality of who Bonnie and Clyde actually were. What remains is to trace how this complicated historical reality transformed, across the decades following their deaths, into the powerful, enduring cultural legend that eventually found its way into everything from Hollywood cinema to the neon-soaked criminal underworld of GTA's XS Vice City, a legend built as much on myth and mediated image as on the messier. More tragic facts of two young lives cut brutally short on a quiet Louisiana highway in the spring of 1934. The death of Bonnie and Clyde on that Louisiana highway in May 1934 did not end their story. In many ways, it only truly began there, because it was in the decades following their deaths that the raw, chaotic, often ugly facts of their actual lives began the long process of transformation into something else entirely, a legend, a myth, a cultural touchstone flexible enough to be reshaped by each successive generation according to its own particular anxieties, aesthetics, and appetites. To understand how two impoverished, traumatized young fugitives from Depression-era Texas eventually became a visual and narrative influence on a 21st-century video game generating billions of dollars in revenue, we need to trace this transformation carefully, decade by decade, medium by medium, watching how the myth accumulated new layers of meaning while gradually shedding the messier, more uncomfortable historical truths that this story has tried to restore throughout the previous 5 parts. The earliest phase of this mythologizing process began almost immediately, even before Bonnie and Clyde's bodies had been buried. As established in Part 4, the crowds that descended on the ambush site, the tens of thousands who attended their separate funerals, and the newspaper coverage that treated their deaths as a major national event rather than simply the conclusion of a regional crime story, all signaled that something larger than ordinary criminal notoriety was already taking shape. Within weeks of their deaths, popular songs began circulating that referenced Bonnie and Clyde, treating their story with a mixture of moral condemnation and undeniable fascination, a duality that would characterize virtually every subsequent cultural treatment of their legend for decades to come. Pulp magazines and true crime publications, a genre experiencing significant popularity during this era, quickly produced sensationalized accounts of the couple's crime spree, often prioritizing dramatic narrative flourishes over strict factual accuracy, further cementing certain mythologized details, the cigar-smoking gun moll, the fearless bank-robbing duo, that, as established in Part 5, diverged considerably from the more complicated historical reality. W. D. Jones's later interviews and Blanche Barrow's own memoir, published decades after the events they described, represent important but relatively marginal counterweights to this dominant mythologizing trend. These first-hand accounts, offering unglamorized, trauma-centered perspectives on life within the Barrow gang, never achieved anywhere near the cultural penetration or popular recognition of the more sensationalized, romanticized versions of the story that continued to circulate and evolve through popular media. This pattern, where the actual participants' sobering, complicated testimonies get overshadowed by more commercially appealing mythologized versions of events, would repeat itself again and again throughout the following decades, as Hollywood, popular music, and eventually digital media each took their turn reshaping Bonnie and Clyde according to the particular aesthetic and commercial demands of their era. The single most consequential moment in this entire mythologizing process arrived in 1967, more than 3 decades after the actual events, with the release of Arthur Penn's film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway in the title roles. This film's cultural impact is genuinely difficult to overstate, both in terms of how it reshaped the specific Bonnie and Clyde legend and in terms of its broader influence on American cinema as a whole. Released during a period of significant social and cultural upheaval in the United States, the height of anti-establishment youth culture, growing skepticism toward traditional institutions of authority, and an evolving relationship between American cinema and increasingly permissive standards around depicting violence and sexuality on screen. The 1967 film reimagined Bonnie and Clyde not as the traumatized, desperate, often pathetic figures that a more historically accurate account would suggest, but as glamorous, sexually charged, almost aspirational rebels, young and beautiful and defiantly alive in a world of stifling conformity and hypocritical authority. The film took enormous liberties with the actual historical record, liberties that a modern audience aware of the more complete history covered in this story's previous parts might find genuinely startling. Faye Dunaway's Bonnie bears little resemblance to the injured, chronically pained young woman limping through her final months of life following the Wellington car accident. The film's Bonnie is glamorous, sensual, and physically vital throughout, her character arc built around themes of sexual frustration and eventual fulfillment that have essentially no basis in the documented historical record. Warren Beatty's Clyde is charismatic and darkly romantic in ways that soften and reframe the actual documented trauma and violence that define the historical Clyde's psychology following his experiences at Eastham Prison Farm. The film compresses, exaggerates, and in many cases simply invents entire sequences and relationships that never occurred, all in service of constructing a more narratively satisfying, more thematically coherent story about youthful rebellion and doomed romantic love than the Messier historical reality could ever have provided on its own. And yet, despite, or perhaps precisely because of, these substantial historical liberties, the 1967 film proved enormously influential, both commercially and culturally. It was a major box office success and received widespread critical acclaim, eventually earning multiple Academy Award nominations and wins. More significantly for our purposes, it fundamentally reshaped the popular understanding and cultural memory of who Bonnie and Clyde actually were, effectively overriding the more complicated, more traumatic historical reality with a glamorized, cinematically satisfying alternative version that would go on to dominate popular consciousness for generations. When most people today picture Bonnie and Clyde, whether they realize it or not, they're very often picturing Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty rather than the actual historical Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, a testament to just how thoroughly this single film succeeded in reconstructing and, in crucial ways, replacing the historical record with its own particular cinematic vision. The film's influence extended well beyond simply reshaping public perception of the specific historical figures. Bonnie and Clyde is widely credited by film historians as a pivotal work in the emergence of what became known as New Hollywood, a significant shift in American filmmaking during the late 1960s and 1970s characterized by greater willingness to depict graphic violence, morally ambiguous protagonists, and narratives that directly challenged or subverted traditional Hollywood storytelling conventions and moral frameworks. The film's controversial, groundbreaking depiction of violence, particularly its famous, extended final ambush sequence, pushed the boundaries of what American cinema had previously depicted on screen, and this stylistic and thematic influence rippled outward through subsequent decades of filmmaking, shaping how later directors would approach depicting crime, violence, and morally complicated anti-hero protagonists in their own work. This cinematic legacy matters enormously for understanding the eventual connection to GTA 6, because the broader aesthetic and narrative tradition that Bonnie and Clyde helped establish, stylish, sympathetic criminal protagonists, morally ambiguous narratives that invite audience identification with characters engaged in serious criminal violence, a specifically American visual and thematic vocabulary built around cars, guns, and doomed romantic partnerships operating outside conventional social norms, became foundational to an entire subsequent genre of American crime storytelling across film, television, literature, and eventually interactive digital media, including video games. The Grand Theft Auto franchise, throughout its entire history, has drawn extensively and self-consciously on exactly this cinematic tradition, constructing its various game worlds and narratives through direct homage to and pastiche of the crime films that Bonnie and Clyde helped inspire and legitimize as serious American cinematic subject matter. Following the massive cultural impact of the 1967 film, subsequent decades brought additional cinematic and cultural treatments of the Bonnie and Clyde story, each reflecting the particular aesthetic sensibilities and cultural preoccupations of its own era. Various television movies, documentaries, and even a short-lived 2013 miniseries continued to revisit and reinterpret the story, with varying degrees of historical accuracy and varying emphasis on different aspects of the couple's relationship and criminal career. Musical treatments, ranging from folk and country songs referencing the couple throughout the mid-20th century to Jay-Z and Beyoncé's 2002 song, '03 Bonnie and Clyde, demonstrate the story's remarkable durability and adaptability across dramatically different musical genres and cultural contexts, with each new artistic interpretation typically emphasizing the couple's romantic devotion and defiant criminality while, characteristically, downplaying or entirely omitting the more traumatic, less glamorous dimensions of their actual documented history. This pattern of selective mythologizing, consistently emphasizing romance, glamour, and defiant rebellion while minimizing or omitting trauma, injury, exploitation, and the genuine human cost of the gang's violence, created, over the decades following their deaths, an increasingly stylized, aestheticized version of Bonnie and Clyde that functions less as historical memory and more as a kind of flexible cultural archetype, the doomed young outlaw couple, beautiful and defiant, choosing a brief, intense life of freedom and love over a longer, more conventional existence of poverty and constraint. This archetype, thoroughly divorced by this point from the specific historical details of the actual Barrow gang's crimes and traumas, became available for adaptation and reference across an enormous range of subsequent cultural products, each drawing on the general emotional and aesthetic template that decades of films, songs, and popular retellings had established, without necessarily requiring or expecting audiences to possess any deep, accurate historical knowledge of the actual events themselves. It's within this broader cultural context, an America that has spent nearly a century progressively mythologizing and aestheticizing the Bonnie and Clyde story into an increasingly abstract archetype of doomed criminal romance, that we can begin to understand the specific connections between this history and the Grand Theft Auto franchise, and specifically the widely discussed influence on GTA 6. The Grand Theft Auto series has, throughout its entire history dating back to the late 1990s, consistently drawn on American crime cinema and popular criminal mythology as core inspirational material for its various game worlds, narrative structures, and character archetypes. Previous entries in the franchise have drawn heavily and explicitly on Miami drug crime aesthetics reminiscent of Scarface and Miami Vice for Vice City, on Los Angeles gang and heist culture for San Andreas, and on a broad range of New York organized crime imagery for various entries set in Liberty City. GTA 6, announced and subsequently detailed through official trailers and promotional materials released by Rockstar Games, marks a significant narrative departure for the franchise specifically through its introduction of a central protagonist duo, Lucia and her partner, presented across promotional materials as a young, romantically involved couple engaged in escalating criminal activity across a fictionalized version of Florida, heavily coded as a contemporary version of the same Vice City setting the franchise had previously explored. This narrative and character structure, a young, romantically devoted criminal couple, navigating a colorful, sun-soaked American landscape through escalating robbery, violence, and evasion of law enforcement, represents an unmistakable, widely acknowledged homage to the broader Bonnie and Clyde archetype that decades of American popular culture, beginning most significantly with the 1967 film, had already established as a recognizable, commercially resonant narrative and aesthetic template. This connection between GTA 6 and the Bonnie and Clyde legend isn't merely speculative fan interpretation, it's been widely discussed and essentially confirmed through the game's own promotional materials and subsequent media coverage, which have explicitly framed the Lucia and Jason narrative as drawing direct inspiration from precisely this tradition of doomed, romantically entangled American criminal couples, with Bonnie and Clyde specifically cited across numerous gaming journalism outlets and cultural commentary pieces as the most obvious and significant historical touchstone for understanding the game's central narrative premise. The specific visual aesthetic choices evident in release trailers and promotional materials, the couple's youthful appearance, their evident romantic devotion depicted through intimate visual framing, their escalating engagement in armed robbery and violent confrontation with law enforcement, all set against a vibrant, almost hyper-real recreation of contemporary Florida criminal culture, draw clearly and consistently on exactly the same emotional and aesthetic template that decades of Bonnie and Clyde mythologizing, from the 1967 film through subsequent musical and cinematic treatments, had already thoroughly established within broader American popular culture. What's particularly notable about this connection, given everything covered in the previous 5 parts of this story, is how thoroughly the video game medium's version of the Bonnie and Clyde archetype has inherited and continued the same selective mythologizing pattern established by decades of prior cinematic and musical treatments. Just as the 1967 film glamorized and romanticized figures whose actual historical reality included severe trauma, chronic physical pain, and profound psychological damage resulting from institutional brutality and systemic poverty, contemporary video game interpretations of this same archetype similarly tend to emphasize style, romantic devotion, and stylized action over any genuine engagement with the more complicated, more uncomfortable historical and psychological realities that this story has worked to restore and contextualize throughout its earlier parts. This isn't necessarily presented as a criticism of GTA 6 specifically, or of the broader entertainment industry's continued fascination with an adaptation of the Bonnie and Clyde archetype more generally. Popular entertainment, across virtually every medium and every era, has always drawn selectively and often quite loosely on historical source material, prioritizing narrative and aesthetic coherence over strict historical accuracy, and there's nothing inherently illegitimate about this creative process. But understanding this pattern, recognizing how thoroughly the popular, widely recognized version of Bonnie and Clyde has diverged from the more complicated, more traumatic actual historical record covered extensively in this story's earlier parts, offers valuable perspective on exactly how historical memory functions within popular culture more broadly, how real human tragedies gradually transform into flexible cultural symbols available for endless reinterpretation and adaptation, often in ways that emphasize certain emotionally resonant elements, youthful romance, defiant rebellion, stylish criminality, while substantially minimizing or entirely erasing other, less commercially appealing elements, institutional trauma, chronic physical suffering, the genuine devastation experienced by law enforcement families and communities directly affected by the gang's actual documented violence. This same pattern of selective cultural memory extends to how contemporary audiences, including many gaming journalists and commentators discussing the GTA 6 connection, typically reference and discuss the real Bonnie and Clyde story. Even coverage explicitly aiming to provide historical context for understanding the game's inspiration often relies heavily on the more mythologized, cinematically influenced version of events rather than the more historically grounded account this particular story has attempted to construct throughout its previous parts, demonstrating just how thoroughly nearly 60 years of cinematic and cultural mythologizing has effectively replaced more historically accurate popular memory, even among audiences and commentators specifically motivated to understand and discuss the true story behind a contemporary cultural product. Understanding this complete arc, from the actual, traumatic historical events of 1930 through 1934, through the immediate sensationalized press coverage of that era, through the transformative cultural impact of the 1967 film, through decades of subsequent musical and cinematic reinterpretation, and finally into contemporary video game culture's continued engagement with this same durable archetype, reveals something genuinely significant about how American popular culture processes, remembers, and continuously reconstructs its own history, particularly history involving crime, violence, poverty, and rebellion against institutional authority. Bonnie and Clyde's actual, complicated, deeply human story has become, over the course of nearly a century, something considerably larger and more culturally significant than the specific historical facts alone could ever have produced on their own, a foundational American mythology about youth, love, defiance, and the seductive, ultimately fatal appeal of choosing a brief, intense life of freedom over a longer, more constrained existence of poverty and conformity. This mythology, whatever its historical distortions and omissions, clearly continues to resonate powerfully with contemporary audiences, evidenced most recently by its acknowledged influence on one of the most anticipated and commercially significant entertainment products of the current era. And perhaps this continued resonance, nearly a century after two impoverished, traumatized young people from Dallas's poorest neighborhoods first crossed paths in a West Dallas kitchen, ultimately tells us something important not just about Bonnie and Clyde specifically, but about enduring American anxieties and fascinations regarding economic inequality, institutional failure, and the eternal, Seductive appeal of stories about young lovers who chose, however destructively and however briefly, to live entirely and defiantly on their own terms. We'll pause here, having traced the complete transformation of Bonnie and Clyde from historical fact into enduring cultural legend, ultimately arriving at their surprising but well-documented influence on GTA VI's central narrative. What remains, in our final part, is to step back and consider the complete legacy of this story, what it ultimately reveals about crime, poverty, mythology, and the American imagination, and how the real history we've now fully explored compares to and complicates the glossy, romanticized legend that continues to captivate audiences nearly a century later. Every legend eventually has to answer to the truth, and the truth about Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow is both smaller and larger than the myth that swallowed them. Smaller, because the actual historical record reveals not master criminals but two badly injured, exhausted, traumatized young people robbing gas stations for grocery money, sleeping in stolen cars, carrying a bag of sandwiches into their own execution. Larger, because the questions their story raises, about poverty, about institutional cruelty, about what a society owes its most desperate citizens, about the strange machinery by which real human suffering gets converted into entertainment, remain every bit as unresolved today, nearly a century later, as they were on that Louisiana highway in May of 1934. In this final part, we step back from the chronology and look at what actually remains, the physical legacy, the historical reckoning, and the uncomfortable questions this story leaves behind for anyone willing to sit with them. Start with the physical remnants, because they tell their own quiet story. The Ford V8 sedan in which Bonnie and Clyde died, riddled with well over 100 bullet holes, did not simply disappear into history, it became, almost immediately, an object of morbid fascination and commercial exploitation. The car's owner, whose vehicle had been stolen by the couple shortly before their deaths, successfully sued for its return and then, recognizing the ghoulish public appetite for anything connected to the ambush, began touring the bullet-scarred vehicle around the country as a paid attraction, charging curious crowds to view the actual death car up close. It changed hands multiple times over the following decades, eventually ending up as a permanent casino attraction in Nevada, where it remains on public display today, still bearing its bullet holes, a piece of automotive wreckage transformed into a tourist curiosity. The clothing Bonnie and Clyde were wearing at the time of their deaths, along with various weapons recovered from the vehicle, similarly became collectible artifacts, bought, sold, and displayed in museums and private collections, a macabre afterlife for objects intimately connected to two violent deaths. The road where the ambush occurred, outside Sales, Louisiana, is now marked with a modest historical monument, and the site continues to attract history enthusiasts, true crime tourists, and casual travelers curious enough to seek out the exact location where America's most mythologized outlaw couple met their end. This kind of dark tourism, the impulse to physically visit sites of historical violence and tragedy, speaks to something enduring in how societies process collective memory, a desire to stand where history happened, to feel some tangible connection to events that have otherwise been filtered through decades of film, song, and second-hand retelling. The human legacy proved considerably more complicated than the physical artifacts. The families left behind, the Barrows and the Parkers, spent the remainder of their lives navigating a peculiar, painful double burden, grieving genuine, personal losses while simultaneously watching those losses transform into public spectacle, entertainment, and eventually commercial product. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, along with Clyde's mother, Cumie Barrow, both lived for decades after their children's deaths, and both, at various points, cooperated with journalists and even participated in early book projects attempting to present more sympathetic, humanizing accounts of their children's lives. Efforts largely overwhelmed by the far more commercially successful and culturally dominant mythologized versions that Hollywood and popular music would eventually produce. There's a particular sadness in imagining these two mothers, for the rest of their lives, watching strangers profit from and romanticize the deaths of the children they had actually raised, fed, worried over, and ultimately buried. Blanche Barrow, as discussed in Part 5, served significant prison time for her role in the gang's activities before eventually being paroled and living out the remainder of her life largely outside the public eye, though she did eventually author a memoir, published posthumously, that offered her own unglamorized, trauma-centered account of her time with the Barrow gang. She reportedly harbored genuine bitterness toward the 1967 film's portrayal of her character, which she felt had unfairly caricatured her as a shrill, hysterical figure for comic relief, a distortion of her actual experience that she found genuinely painful given everything she had actually endured, the loss of her husband, the permanent blindness in one eye, the years of imprisonment for crimes she had participated in reluctantly rather than enthusiastically. W.D. Jones similarly served prison time before eventually settling into a quieter, more anonymous adult life, though by most accounts he continued to struggle throughout his life with the psychological aftermath of his teenage entanglement with Clyde's violence. Henry Methvin, whose family's cooperation with Frank Hamer's posse had directly enabled the fatal ambush, did receive the leniency that had been promised in exchange for that cooperation regarding his role in the earlier Eastham prison break killing, though he continued to face legal consequences for other crimes and was eventually killed years later in an unrelated incident, his own life ending in violence just as the gang he had briefly belonged to had predicted for nearly all its members. Frank Hamer, the lawman whose patient, methodical pursuit finally ended the Barrow gang's 2-year reign of violence, continued his law enforcement career for years afterward and became something of a legendary figure in Texas law enforcement history, though even his role in the ambush attracted lasting controversy and criticism from those who viewed the complete absence of any warning or surrender opportunity as ethically troubling, regardless of how thoroughly Bonnie and Clyde's documented history of violence might have justified an aggressive law enforcement response. This lingering controversy over the ambush's tactics points toward perhaps the most important and enduring question this story leaves behind: what do we actually owe, as a society, to people who have committed genuine, serious violence, even when that violence emerged from circumstances of extreme poverty, institutional brutality, and trauma? This isn't a question with a comfortable answer, and it's a question that extends well beyond the specific historical circumstances of Bonnie and Clyde into much broader, ongoing debates about criminal justice, policing tactics, and how societies balance legitimate public safety concerns against basic principles of due process and human dignity, even for individuals who have caused genuine harm to others. The historical record makes clear that Bonnie and Clyde caused real, substantial harm: 9 law enforcement officers killed, additional civilian casualties, and immeasurable trauma inflicted on the families and communities connected to their victims. This harm was real, and the grief experienced by those officers' families deserves to be remembered and honored just as much as the more culturally dominant, romanticized narrative of Bonnie and Clyde's own doomed love story. At the same time, the historical record equally makes clear that both Bonnie and Clyde were themselves products of circumstances that offer genuine, important context for understanding, though never excusing, their subsequent choices: crushing generational poverty, a criminal justice system that subjected Clyde to horrific institutional violence and offered him no meaningful path toward rehabilitation or genuine opportunity, and a broader economic collapse that had devastated legitimate opportunities for millions of working-class Americans exactly like the Barrow and Parker families. Holding both of these truths simultaneously, genuine harm caused, genuine trauma endured, resists the kind of simple moral categorization that popular mythology, in all its various forms across nearly a century of retelling, has generally preferred to offer its audiences. The 1967 film wanted heroes, or at least deeply sympathetic anti-heroes, worth of audience identification and romantic investment. Popular songs wanted doomed romantic tragedy. Even much of the true crime genre's coverage over the decades has tended to flatten Bonnie and Clyde into either straightforward villains or, more commonly given the enduring romantic mythology, glamorous rebels worthy of a certain admiring fascination. The actual historical reality, as this story has attempted to reconstruct across its previous 6 parts, resists both of these simplified framings, insisting instead on a messier, more uncomfortable truth: that perpetrators of genuine violence can simultaneously be victims of genuine systemic failure, and that neither truth diminishes or excuses the other. This complexity extends meaningfully into how we should think about the story's most recent cultural manifestation, its acknowledged influence on GTA's central narrative. There's nothing inherently wrong with popular entertainment continuing to draw inspiration from this durable, emotionally resonant archetype of doomed young criminal lovers. American culture has been doing exactly this for nearly 60 years, dating back to the 1967 film, And there's no particular reason to expect or demand that a video game bear the burden of historical accuracy that even far more explicitly historical films and books have consistently failed to maintain. But understanding the actual history behind the archetype, recognizing the real trauma, the real chronic physical suffering, the real grieving families on both sides of the violence, the real institutional failures that shaped two young people's trajectory toward death on a Louisiana highway, adds a dimension of understanding and even a certain moral weight to engaging with these contemporary cultural products that a purely surface-level, aestheticized engagement with the archetype simply cannot provide. There's also something worth considering about why this particular story, among the countless crime narratives from American history, has proven so uniquely durable and adaptable across nearly a century of retelling and reinterpretation. Part of the answer surely lies in the specific combination of elements Bonnie and Clyde's actual story provides: youth, romantic devotion, dramatic violence, a clear narrative arc moving from desperate poverty through defiant criminality toward an inevitable, dramatically staged death. But part of the answer also surely lies in how thoroughly their story taps into persistent, unresolved American anxieties about economic inequality and institutional failure, anxieties that were acute during the actual Great Depression era of their lives and crimes, and that have arguably only intensified in various ways across subsequent decades, right up through our current moment, as concerns about wealth inequality, criminal justice reform, and the adequacy of social safety nets continue to occupy significant space in American political and cultural discourse. Bonnie and Clyde, in this sense, function as a kind of persistent cultural pressure valve, a story that allows audiences to safely explore and process complicated, ambivalent feelings about criminality, poverty, institutional authority, and rebellion without requiring any of the more uncomfortable, harder-to-resolve engagement that directly confronting these same issues in contemporary, real-world contexts might demand. It's considerably easier, psychologically and culturally, to romanticize two dead outlaws from nearly a century ago than to grapple directly with the ongoing, unresolved versions of the same structural problems: poverty, inadequate criminal justice systems, limited economic opportunity, that continue to shape countless contemporary lives in ways that rarely receive anywhere near the same level of cultural attention, sympathy, or mythologizing that Bonnie and Clyde's specific historical circumstances eventually received. This is, perhaps, the final and most important thing this story leaves us with, not simply a fascinating, dramatic historical narrative about two doomed young outlaws, but a genuine invitation to think more carefully about how societies remember, mythologize, and ultimately commercialize their own histories of violence, poverty, and institutional failure. Bonnie and Clyde have become, over nearly a century, considerably more valuable as cultural symbols and commercial products than they ever were as living, breathing human beings struggling, however destructively, to survive circumstances that offered them remarkably few legitimate alternatives. There's something worth sitting with in that transformation, something that speaks not just to who Bonnie and Clyde actually were, but to who we, as audiences continuously consuming and reinterpreting their story across each new generation and each new medium, actually are as well. Bonnie Parker was 23 years old when she died. Clyde Barrow was 25. They had known each other for barely 4 years, most of that time spent running, hiding, and preparing for violence they both seemed to understand, with growing clarity as those 4 years progressed, would very likely claim their lives before either of them reached 30. Whatever else they were, killers, victims, lovers, symbols, commercial products, video game inspiration, they were, first and foremost, two desperately poor young people from the worst neighborhoods Depression-era Dallas had to offer, who found in each other something that felt, however fleetingly and however destructively, like an answer to lives that had otherwise offered them almost nothing at all. That's the story beneath the legend. That's the truth beneath the myth. And nearly a century later, as their story continues to echo through American popular culture in forms neither of them could possibly have imagined, standing on that quiet Louisiana highway with sandwiches in a paper bag and a lifetime of trauma behind them, it remains a story worth telling honestly, not just as entertainment, but as history that still has something important to teach us about who gets remembered, who gets mythologized, and who gets forgotten in the long, complicated process of turning real human tragedy into legend. If this story pulled you into the shadows of history tonight, you know what to do. hit subscribe, because there are more tales like this one waiting in the dark, more forgotten lives and violent legends still to uncover. Like this video if you made it all the way to the end with me, drop a comment telling me what part hit you hardest, and stick around, because the underworld has plenty more stories left to tell.